we need to be ready to, in a relatively short period of time, to stand up to our main threat. And the main threat at this point is Russia.
The big issue is going to be fragmentation of the market rather than straight up building capacity. We have something of a recruitment crisis, which is not unique to Europe. It's also the case in the US and, interestingly enough, the case in China.
Can Europe afford to go it alone on defense, or at least without the substantial support from the US that it's come to expect over the past 8 decades? Well, my guests today have written a new report on just that question. Guntram Wolff and Alexandr Burilkov are both with the think tank Bruegel in Brussels. Welcome to you both. Guntram, I want to start with you. How urgent is this question of Europe's ability to afford its own defense in full, apart from the US?
Well, I think the question is super urgent. We have a new US administration that cannot be relied upon, to put it mildly and politely. And I think we need to be clear that this habit of relying on the United States that is quite deeply ingrained in our collective DNA, societal DNA, and that is actually also very present in security circles. I mean, that assumption is actually quite questionable. And so, yes, we need to be ready to, in a relatively short period of time, to stand up to our main threat. And the main threat at this point is Russia.
Russia is, of course, also the big threat here in Europe. In your report, in fact, you write that its military is now bigger than the one that invaded Ukraine in 2022. In fact, if you compare 2024 to 2022, it produced more than 3 times as many tanks and more than double the numbers of both armored vehicles and artillery pieces. It also produced significantly more long-range missiles. I want to ask you guys, maybe Alex, we'll start with you. Where is the sticking point here when we look at Europe's defense? Is it money? Is it manpower? Is it equipment? Is it all of the above?
There are a couple issues that are real sticking points. Personnel is, of course, one, in that we have something of a recruitment crisis, which is not unique to Europe. It's also the case in the US and, interestingly enough, the case in China. It is not, however, the case in Russia, which can afford to pay contract soldiers very generous salaries by local standards and still benefits from a shared cultural heritage that allows it to mobilize large numbers of men. Equipment, of course, another very serious problem that we have. We have a totally fragmented procurement landscape where the cost of items is much higher than it should be, even compared to other big spenders like the United States, and especially compared to Russia and also China's state-owned enterprises for military production. So that is another factor for sure. And finally, when we look at our ability to defend ourselves, we lack something that in the report we identify as strategic enablers, which put in plain speak are the very high-end technologically sophisticated items that traditionally in NATO are the responsibility of the United States. And when I talk about strategic enablers, I mean things like strategic bombers, very large aircraft. I mean strategic lift, which is large transport aircraft. We have a few, but of course the United States has a far greater capacity for that than we do. I mean also things like long-distance logistics, which is something that we are fairly weak in, and essentially satellites as well, spaceborne assets. This is something that the United States is primarily responsible for. And while these on the surface might seem like boutique capabilities or things that are not important, in fact, they very much are, because fighting a modern peer conflict is reliant on these. The ability of Ukraine to access these via assistance, especially from the US, was essential in preventing a Russian victory in 2022. And conversely, the Russians, of course, are not as sophisticated as the United States. They don't have the same numbers of these systems, but they do have them. They do have their own space network. They have their own strategic bombers. They have their own long-range missiles. They have their own logistics troops, which are all things that create a military asymmetry between Europe and Russia. That is a source of concern.
A GDP increase of just over 0.1% for the entire EU in spending would suffice, in defense spending, would suffice to overcome the financing needs that the EU would need. That sounds easy when we're looking at just about 0.1%. Why is it so hard for nations to do that?
Well, I mean, just to be clear, so the 0.1% is the amount of support that we would need to provide to Ukraine, in addition to what we are doing at the moment in terms of military support. So at the moment, the United States supports Ukraine to the tune of 0.1% of EU GDP per year. That's 20 billion roughly. And that 20 billion is would be missing in case the US was to withdraw. So this is, I think, the easy bit, finding the resources to support Ukraine. The more difficult bit is finding the resources to actually build our own deterrence capacities. And there, it's not actually straightforward to compute from what Alex described in terms of the numbers of tanks, the numbers of satellites and bombers, to an actual number in terms of public expenses. So the fiscal dimension of this isn't so easy to compute. And the reason is very simple. The reason is that we do not know the prices of many of these goods if we produce them at scale. So what we are doing at the moment is we are purchasing a lot of military material, but actually at low numbers, right? I mean, we are talking here, just to give the tank example, we are buying, Germany has bought since the beginning of 2022, has bought a bit more than 100 Leopard 2 tanks, big, heavy fighting tanks. They will be delivered only by the year 2030. So that's actually just a handful per year, and that means the price is very high. Yet Russia produces over 1,000 tanks, perhaps 1,400 tanks per year at the moment. So we are talking here of very different numbers, and if you move the numbers from a handful to hundreds or even thousands, of course, the cost per unit is coming down. Having said that, if we do that exercise, our back of the envelope estimation is that defense spending in Europe would need to increase by 1.5% of GDP, at least, if not 2% of GDP.
We've already seen some nations like Denmark pledging to spend significantly more just to equip themselves for the years ahead. How much capacity does Europe's defense industry actually have to respond to that, assuming that other nations do the same, and to build out and lower those unit costs, as you've said?
The big issue is going to be fragmentation of the market rather than straight up building capacity, because one of the main challenges that we have to overcome when preparing for any possible Russian aggression is that we are fundamentally a number of countries with their own national economies, national cultures, national priorities, and the Russians have more or less 10 people that decide everything. And that means that their production, their target goals, even mundane things like the design of their vehicles is extremely unified. And in order to be able to actually leverage our capacities for production, that is the first real challenge we have to overcome, is to get rid of this kind of system of gold plating and national priorities and requirements so that our systems become truly interoperable. That's challenge number one. Challenge number two is, of course, the question of capacity. This is a challenge that always existed, has now been made worse. It's also something that exists, of course, in the US, whose production capabilities have atrophied compared to the Cold War, but is, as Guntram pointed out, particularly acute in Europe, even for basic things like tanks that are lost in large numbers in pure conflict. And so overcoming that problem is the first step to actually rebuilding European deterrence. And without addressing that, it will be difficult to do so. It is not that it is impossible. I really want to qualify this. During the Cold War, we saw that West European market economies, and West Germany is a particularly good example of that. When push came to shove, including in the 70s, when the Soviets modernized their military, they were able to quickly field thousands of new vehicles when it was necessary. So we have the kind of historical background for the possibility of this task.
But this is, as you mentioned, a defense industry fractured over 27 nations. If you look just at the EU, the EU's been talking about this for decades. Is it really possible within a short amount of time to find that kind of collaboration and consolidation? Are things at least moving in a positive direction in recent years?
Well, I mean, political forecasts are always difficult to make, and they depend also on election outcomes. And we have, of course, an important election upcoming in Germany only this weekend. So let's see what that will bring. But I would say my overall take is that, of course, for decades the EU has been discussing that, but it never really moved. But the reason is also it never really had to move, right? The United States was there covering our backs, right? So this is changing, and I think it is changing in such a fundamental way that everybody realizes it is changing, including our politicians and head of governments. But I would go broader. I would say citizens in our societies really see what's going on in the United States and understand that the necessities are different than they used to be. And so I think there is a real chance to move forward and to overcome some of that fragmentation. And let me just emphasize that in terms of the capacities to produce, I mean, I'm very convinced that we actually do have very substantial industrial capacities on our continent. If you take Germany alone, Germany has seen its industrial sector actually shrink in size quite a bit in the last couple of years. That means there are redundancies. There are people out there that know how to operate an industrial robot, to put it simply, and that might currently actually be on the market and really search for jobs. So what we as a macroeconomist would expect is that this additional spending, a spending boost on defense, will in fact in the short term actually boost economic activity and boost manufacturing sector output. And in that sense, it should be absolutely feasible, but it is a political challenge and of course a fiscal challenge. One has to mobilize the resources.
Germany, a country that's been very hesitant to raise deficit spending, I should say, it's going to have to take on a significant amount of debt or deficit spending if it's going to meet the requirements that you put forth in this study. A lot of that is going to fall on Germany. Is that realistic?
Fiscally, Germany has a debt ratio that is not very high in global comparison and in European comparison. The interest burden in the German budget is moderate, is totally manageable. The rating is top. So, of course, Germany can, if it wants to, raise the 5 or 10% of GDP on global financial markets to fund its defense expenditure, its increase in defense expenditure. So economically, totally feasible. Politically, you're right, it's more difficult. It's a difficult discussion. But I take some sort of optimism from the fact that the conservative lead candidate for chancellery, Friedrich Merz, has himself admitted that it might be necessary to actually go after or at least address some of the constraints derived from the German debt brake, which is the tight fiscal rule.
You also write that it's going to be required that there are the equivalent of 300,000 U.S. troops if we see the U.S. really pull out. 300,000, the equivalent of 300,000 U.S. troops to be found in Europe. How difficult will that be to find?
So we come to that number by looking at the 100,000 or so US troops that are here at the moment, and then taking into account recent American governmental research that calculated that in order to shore up deterrence in Europe, it would be necessary to draw up and bring in another 150,000 US troops at least. It should be noted that American troops in Europe tend to be both more strongly equipped than their equivalent European troops if you are raising them from multinational coalition, and they benefit from American strategic enablers that I talked about before, and they benefit from a singular command and control structure that makes them more effective than scattered national forces that haven't necessarily trained before as a singular unit in large-scale exercises. So this is the logic that we use to come up to this number. The question about raising these troops in roughly 50 brigades, which are units of 4,000 to 6,000 soldiers each, is not an impossible one. As Guntram outlined, the political will is there in a way that it has never been. We have been exposed to a shock in transatlantic relations, as well as a deteriorating situation on NATO in the EU's eastern flank. So if there is any moment when there is political impetus for raising these forces, it is now. And we already see countries that are closer to Russia, especially Poland, taking the lead on that. These are countries that have experience in raising forces recently, that have experience in questions of conscription, of territorial defense, both of which have been fundamental to Ukraine's continued ability to resist Russian aggression. And so, from my perspective, this is a historic moment where raising these troops has become possible.
I touched on this earlier, but how dangerous would Russia be to Europe in the coming years? It depends, of course, on whether the war continues and what capacity it continues, or whether there is a ceasefire or peace agreement of some sort.
I think it's important to qualify the question of Russia by realizing that it is neither as strong as it wishes to appear, but neither as weak as we wish it to be. There are still a fair number of open questions about the Russian military's ability to reconstitute and modernize itself following the cessation of hostilities. So we have to operate based on the evidence we have from the past 3 years of conflict as the best marker. We know that the Russian military entered the conflict not in the shape that its generals would have liked it to be in, despite modernization and the experience of Syria. But we also have sobering evidence that the Russian military is a learning organization, and it is one that has managed to modernize and increase in size in the past 3 years. So this is the framework that we are operating in. But at the end of the day, it should be noted that Europe has much greater economic and industrial potential. It has a much larger population as well. And fundamentally, the threat that is posed by Russia is a function of the weakened state of European militaries. It is not a question that cannot be addressed satisfactorily with the effort that we outline. Such an effort would essentially remove the ability of Russia to effect a breakthrough anywhere on European territory, and that would remove the incentive from the Kremlin to make such an attempt, and it would restore deterrence for Europe through European means.
All right. That was Alexandr Burilkov. He's joined by Guntram Wolff, and they're both with the think tank Bruegel. Guys, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.